Anchoring bias. Picture this. You walk into a car dealership, and the salesperson shows you a sleek sedan with a sticker price of $35,000. You negotiate hard and eventually agree on $28,000, walking away feeling victorious. But here's what you didn't realize. That initial $35,000 price tag just hijacked your brain through something called anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is our tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information we encounter when making decisions. That initial number, fact, or impression becomes an anchor, a reference point that influences all subsequent judgments, even when it's completely irrelevant to the decision at hand. Anchoring bias affects major life decisions. In salary negotiations, the first offer made dramatically influences the final agreement. Studies show that when job candidates make the first offer, they typically receive higher salaries than when employers lead. Real estate agents know this instinctively, often showing expensive properties first to anchor buyers' expectations higher. The legal system isn't immune either. Judges, despite their training to be objective, show anchoring effects when sentencing. In one study, judges who were asked to consider whether a shoplifter should receive more or less than 9 months in prison gave average sentences of 8 months. Those asked about more or less than 2 months averaged 5 months. The random anchor influenced trained legal professionals making consequential decisions. But anchoring isn't just about numbers. First impressions in job interviews create anchors that color how interviewers interpret everything that follows. If you start strong, subsequent mistakes are often minimized. Start poorly, and later achievements may be undervalued. Here's what makes anchoring particularly insidious. We're influenced by anchors even when we know they're irrelevant. In experiments, people are told that numbers are randomly generated, yet these meaningless figures still affect their estimates. Your rational mind might reject the anchor, but your intuitive system has already been influenced. The business world exploits anchoring constantly. That premium option on the menu makes the mid-priced item seem reasonable. The first price you see in a store becomes your reference point for all other prices. Online retailers show original prices crossed out next to sale prices, creating anchors that make discounts seem more attractive. So how do you defend against unwanted anchoring? First, try to generate your own estimates before receiving any numbers or suggestions. Research market prices before negotiating. When making important decisions, explicitly consider what the appropriate range should be, independent of any anchors you've encountered. Remember, anchoring isn't always bad. It can provide useful starting points for complex decisions. The key is recognizing when you're being anchored and asking yourself, is this reference point truly relevant to my decision? Or is it just the first number I happen to hear? Your mind will always search for anchors to simplify complex judgments. The question is whether you'll choose your anchors deliberately or let others choose them for you. The Availability Heuristic. Quick question. Are there more words in the English language that start with the letter R, or have R as their third letter? Take a moment to think about it. If you're like most people, you probably said words starting with R, like red, river, and rainbow, come to mind easily, while words with R as the third letter seem harder to think of. But you'd be wrong. There are actually more words with R in the third position, words like car, word, bird, and park. The availability heuristic is our tendency to estimate the likelihood of events based on how easily we can remember examples of them occurring. If we can quickly think of instances of something happening, we judge it as more likely to happen. If examples don't readily come to mind, we assume the event is rare. This mental shortcut evolved for good reasons. In our ancestral environment, memorable events often were more common or important. If you could easily recall dangerous animals in your area, they probably posed a real threat. But in our modern, media-saturated world, this ancient wisdom can lead us seriously astray. Consider how the availability heuristic shapes our perception of risk. After watching news coverage of airplane crashes, many people develop a fear of flying, even though they're statistically safer in an airplane than driving to the airport. The vivid, memorable nature of airplane disasters makes them feel more likely than car accidents, even though traffic fatalities are vastly more common. Terrorism provides another stark example. Americans worry more about terrorist attacks than heart disease, even though heart disease kills hundreds of times more people annually. Why? Terrorist attacks receive massive media coverage, creating vivid, easily recalled memories. Heart disease, despite being a much greater threat, kills quietly and individually, generating fewer memorable stories. The media industry inadvertently exploits the availability heuristic. If it bleeds, it leads isn't just a catchy phrase, it's a reflection of how memorable, dramatic events capture our attention and stick in our minds. Stories about rare but frightening events, child abductions, shark attacks, school shootings, receive disproportionate coverage compared to their actual frequency, skewing our perception of their likelihood. This bias affects personal decisions too. People who know someone who developed lung cancer may overestimate their own cancer risk, especially if they smoke. Those who've experienced a car accident often become more cautious drivers, at least temporarily. The vivid personal experience makes the risk feel more real and immediate. Investment decisions fall prey to the availability heuristic constantly. After a market crash, investors flee to safer assets, forgetting that markets historically recover. During booms, people pour money into risky investments, remembering only recent success stories. Day traders often focus on their memorable wins, while forgetting their more numerous but less dramatic losses. Social media amplifies this bias dramatically. Our news feeds create echo chambers filled with the most engaging, emotional, and memorable content. Stories of rare but shocking events spread virally, while everyday positive occurrences remain invisible. This curated reality distorts our perception of how the world actually works. The availability heuristic even affects professionals who should know better. Emergency room doctors see the worst-case scenarios daily, potentially overestimating the likelihood of rare conditions. Insurance adjusters who handle unusual claims might overweight their probability. But the bias isn't just about dramatic events. It affects mundane judgments too. When asked to estimate how often they perform various activities, people overestimate memorable actions and underestimate routine ones. They remember the times they exercised or ate healthy food, while forgetting the days they didn't. So, how can you think more clearly about probability and risk? First, actively seek out base rates and statistics, rather than relying on memory alone. Before making decisions based on dramatic examples, ask, how often does this actually happen? Second, remember that memorable doesn't mean likely. The events that stick in your mind often do so precisely because they're unusual. Confirmation bias. Imagine you believe that left-handed people are more creative than right-handed people. As you go through life, you'll probably notice left-handed artists, musicians, and writers. Look, you'll think, another creative left-hander. But you might not pay much attention to the right-handed artists or the left-handed accountants. Without realizing it, you're falling victim to one of the most powerful forces shaping human thinking: confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is our tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information in ways that confirm our pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses. We give preferential treatment to information that supports what we already think, while dismissing, distorting, or forgetting information that challenges our views. This isn't a conscious process. Most people believe they're being objective and fair-minded. But our brains are constantly filtering the overwhelming flood of information around us, and they use our existing beliefs as a guide for what's important and what's not. We become detectives looking for evidence to support our predetermined conclusions, rather than scientists seeking truth wherever it leads. The bias appears in how we seek information. People tend to ask questions that are likely to produce answers supporting their hypotheses. If you believe a job candidate is qualified, you might ask about their successes. If you think they're unfit, you'll focus on potential weaknesses. Either way, you'll get information that confirms your initial impression. We also interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that support our beliefs. Take political debates. Supporters of each candidate often claim their person won, even when watching the identical event. The same words and actions get filtered through different belief systems, leading to completely different conclusions about what happened. Memory plays a crucial role too. We better remember details that confirm our beliefs while forgetting contradictory information. Studies show that people recall more examples supporting their political views and fewer examples challenging them, even when originally exposed to equal amounts of each type of information. Social media has created unprecedented opportunities for confirmation bias to flourish. Algorithms track our clicks, likes, and engagement, then feed us more content similar to what we've already shown interest in. This creates filter bubbles, where we're primarily exposed to information that reinforces our existing views. Our news feeds become echo chambers, amplifying our beliefs while filtering out challenging perspectives. The financial world provides stark examples of confirmation bias in action. Investors often seek out analysts and news sources that support their investment thesis while avoiding contradictory viewpoints. They might obsess over positive news about stocks they own, while dismissing negative reports as biased or irrelevant. This can lead to holding losing positions far too long or missing important warning signs. Medical professionals aren't immune. Once doctors form an initial diagnosis, they may unconsciously focus on symptoms that support their hypothesis while overlooking contradictory evidence. This anchoring on initial impressions can delay correct diagnoses and appropriate treatment. Scientific research, despite its emphasis on objectivity, struggles with confirmation bias. Researchers may unconsciously design experiments that are more likely to support their theories. They might interpret ambiguous results in ways that confirm their hypotheses or remember the studies that support their views while forgetting contradictory findings. The bias extends to how we view ourselves. Most people seek feedback that confirms their positive self-image while avoiding or discounting criticism. We remember compliments better than criticisms and interpret neutral feedback as more positive than it actually was. This can prevent personal growth and learning from mistakes. Confirmation bias creates several serious problems. It prevents us from updating our beliefs when we encounter new evidence, leading to poor decisions based on outdated or incorrect information. It polarizes groups by reinforcing existing disagreements rather than promoting understanding, and it makes us overconfident in our beliefs, even when they're based on limited or biased evidence. Perhaps most dangerously, confirmation bias makes us think we're being objective when we're actually being selective. We believe we're carefully weighing evidence when we're really just collecting ammunition for predetermined conclusions. The Dunning-Kruger effect. In 1999, a man named MacArthur Wheeler robbed 2 Pittsburgh banks in broad daylight without any disguise. When police arrested him that evening, he was genuinely shocked. You see, Wheeler had covered his face with lemon juice before the robberies, believing it would make him invisible to security cameras. His reasoning? Lemon juice is used in invisible ink, so surely it would make his face invisible too. This bizarre case inspired psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger to investigate a profound question. Are incompetent people too incompetent to realize they're incompetent? Their research revealed one of psychology's most robust findings, the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect describes how people with limited knowledge or skill in a domain tend to overestimate their own competence in that domain. It's not simply that they don't know something. They don't know that they don't know, and this ignorance inflates their confidence to dangerous levels. In their original study, Dunning and Kruger tested college students on logic, grammar, and humor. They found that students who scored in the bottom quartile consistently overestimated their performance. Those who scored in the 12th percentile thought they had performed better than 62% of their peers. The lowest performers weren't just wrong about their abilities, they were wrong by enormous margins. Here's the cruel irony. The same lack of skill that leads to poor performance also leads to the inability to recognize that poor performance. To know how good you are at something, you need to know what good performance looks like. But if you lack that knowledge, you can't accurately judge your own abilities. This effect appears everywhere in modern life. Studies show that 93% of American drivers believe they're above-average drivers, a mathematical impossibility. In academics, students who perform poorly on tests are often the most confident about their performance beforehand. In the workplace, the least competent employees often rate their job performance most highly. The internet age has amplified the Dunning-Kruger effect dramatically. Social media platforms give everyone a voice on complex topics, from climate science to economic policy. People who've read a few articles suddenly feel qualified to debate experts who've spent decades studying these subjects. The comment sections of news websites become battlegrounds where confidence inversely correlates with knowledge. Consider medical misinformation online. People with no medical training confidently contradict doctors and researchers, armed with cherry-picked studies they don't understand. They mistake information for knowledge, and Google searches for expertise. Their certainty is genuine but dangerous. The effect isn't limited to others. We all fall victim to it in domains outside our expertise. That weekend warrior who thinks they could coach professional sports. The amateur investor convinced they've discovered a foolproof trading strategy. The person who watches a few YouTube videos and believes they can renovate their entire house. Interestingly, as people actually become more competent, they often become less confident. True experts understand the complexity and nuance in their fields. They know what they don't know. Meanwhile, novices see only the tip of the iceberg and assume that's all their island. This creates a paradoxical world where the most knowledgeable people doubt themselves while the least knowledgeable speak with absolute certainty. In group discussions, the voice of ignorance often drowns out the whisper of wisdom. So how do we combat the Dunning-Kruger effect? First, actively seek out your ignorance. Before forming strong opinions, ask yourself, what don't I know about this topic? What would an expert say about my reasoning? Second, embrace intellectual humility. Phrases like, I don't know, and I might be wrong, become tools of wisdom, not weakness. When learning new skills, be suspicious of early confidence. That moment when everything seems to make sense might be precisely when you know just enough to be dangerous. Seek feedback from genuine experts, not just confirmation from fellow beginners. Remember, competence is a journey, not a destination. The Dunning-Kruger effect reminds us that the more we learn, the more we realize there is to learn. True wisdom begins with acknowledging the vast territory of our ignorance. In our age of information overload, perhaps the most valuable skill isn't knowing everything, it's knowing the limits of what we know. Self-serving bias. Here's a curious fact about marriage. In surveys, both husbands and wives typically claim they do more than 50% of the household chores. Mathematically impossible, yet both parties genuinely believe their claims. This isn't deliberate deception, it's self-serving bias, our tendency to interpret information in ways that favor ourselves, our actions, and our beliefs. Self-serving bias manifests in two primary ways. First, we tend to attribute our successes to internal factors like skill, effort, and intelligence, while attributing our failures to external factors like bad luck, unfair circumstances, or other people's mistakes. Second, we interpret ambiguous situations in ways that make us look good, give ourselves the benefit of the doubt, and remember our past behavior more favorably than it actually was. Consider how this plays out in the workplace. When employees receive positive performance reviews, they typically attribute the success to their hard work, talent, and dedication. When reviews are negative, suddenly it's about unclear expectations, insufficient resources, or a biased supervisor. The same person can simultaneously take credit for successes while deflecting blame for failures. Athletes provide textbook examples of self-serving bias. Winners often credit their preparation, strategy, and skill. Losers point to injuries, poor officiating, or lucky breaks by their opponents. Professional sports interviews become predictable scripts. We executed our game plan perfectly versus we didn't get the calls, or the ball didn't bounce our way. Students exhibit similar patterns. Good grades result from studying hard and understanding the material. Poor grades happen because the test was unfair, the teacher didn't explain things clearly, or there wasn't enough time to study. The same student can attribute an A in one class to personal merit while blaming a C in another on external circumstances. The bias extends to how we view our relationships. In conflicts with friends, family, or romantic partners, we typically see ourselves as reasonable and the other person as stubborn or unreasonable. We remember our own hurtful comments as justified responses to provocation, while remembering others' comments as unprovoked attacks. Both parties in a disagreement often feel they're the victim of the other's unreasonable behavior. Self-serving bias shapes our memories in remarkable ways. People tend to remember their past selves as less competent than their current selves, making their improvement seem more dramatic. They recall their past behavior as more virtuous than it actually was, and their mistakes as less serious than others remember them. This rosy retrospection helps maintain positive self-esteem, but can prevent learning from past errors. The phenomenon appears in group settings too. Team members typically overestimate their own contributions to group projects, while underestimating others' contributions. This creates the mathematically impossible situation where everyone believes they did more than their fair share of the work. Corporate managers often claim more credit for company successes than their subordinates believe they deserve. Investment behavior showcases self-serving bias dramatically. When investors make money, they attribute it to their skill, research, and market insight. When they lose money, it's because of market manipulation, unexpected events, or bad advice from others. This prevents them from learning from mistakes and leads to overconfidence in future investment decisions. The bias serves important psychological functions. It helps maintain self-esteem, motivation, and mental health. People who consistently blame themselves for negative outcomes often develop depression and anxiety. A moderate amount of self-serving bias can provide the confidence needed to take risks and persist through challenges. But self-serving bias creates significant problems too. It prevents accurate self-assessment, making it harder to improve and learn from mistakes. It damages relationships when people can't acknowledge their role in conflicts or problems. It leads to overconfidence and poor decision-making when people consistently overestimate their abilities and underestimate the role of luck in their successes. The bias also contributes to fundamental attribution error in how we judge others. We attribute our own failures to circumstances, but others' failures to their character. When we're late to a meeting, it's because of unexpected traffic. When others are late, it's because they're disorganized or inconsiderate. The gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy is our mistaken belief that past random events affect the probability of future random events. When we see a streak of similar outcomes, we intuitively feel that a different outcome becomes more likely, as if the universe needs to balance things out. But true randomness doesn't work that way. It has no memory, no sense of fairness, and no obligation to create patterns that feel right to human brains. This bias emerges from our evolved tendency to find patterns and meaning in the world around us. For our ancestors, pattern recognition was crucial for survival, identifying which plants were poisonous, predicting weather changes, or recognizing threatening animals. But this same system that helps us navigate a complex world leads us astray when dealing with truly random events. Consider coin flips. If you flip a fair coin and get heads 4 times in a row, what's the probability of getting heads on the 5th flip? Your intuition might say it's less than 50%. Surely tails is due after all those heads. But the actual probability is still exactly 50%. Each flip is independent. The coin has no memory of previous flips, and the universe isn't keeping score to ensure equal outcomes. This misconception shows up everywhere in daily life. Basketball fans talk about players being hot or cold, believing that making several shots in a row makes a player more likely to make the next shot, or that missing several makes them due for a make. Extensive analysis of shooting data shows no evidence of these streaks beyond what random chance would predict, yet the belief persists because our brains desperately want to find patterns. Lottery players exhibit classic gambler's fallacy thinking. They avoid numbers that came up recently, believing these numbers are less likely to appear again soon. They favor numbers that haven't appeared in a while, thinking they're due. Some even use complex systems based on previous drawings, not realizing that each drawing is completely independent of all previous ones. The stock market provides fertile ground for gamblers' fallacy thinking. After a market has risen for several days, investors may expect a correction, believing the market is due for a fall. Conversely, after several down days, they might expect an upturn. While markets do have underlying economic forces that create trends, random daily fluctuations often get misinterpreted as meaningful patterns. Parents expecting their 3rd child sometimes fall into this trap. If they already have 2 boys, they might feel more confident that the 3rd will be a girl, as if nature seeks gender balance within families. But each pregnancy has the same roughly 50-50 probability, regardless of previous children's genders. The fallacy appears in hiring decisions too. If an interviewer has seen several weak candidates in a row, they might unconsciously expect the next candidate to be stronger, feeling it's time for a good one. This can lead to inflated evaluations of average candidates who simply had good timing. Weather represents another area where the gambler's fallacy clouds thinking. After several rainy days, people might feel sunny weather is more likely, even when weather patterns suggest continued rain. They mistake random fluctuations in weather for meaningful sequences that need balancing. What makes the gambler's fallacy particularly insidious is that it feels so logically sound. Our intuition says that if something unusual happens, like 5 black numbers in a row at roulette, then something should happen to restore balance. This intuition works well in many areas of life where events are connected, but fails completely with truly independent random events. The fallacy becomes especially dangerous when money is involved. Gamblers who've lost several hands in a row may increase their bets, convinced that a win is overdue. Day traders might double down on losing positions, believing their luck has to change. These behaviors transform small losses into catastrophic ones. Understanding true randomness is psychologically difficult because random sequences don't look random to us. A truly random sequence of coin flips might produce long streaks of heads or tails that seem impossibly unlikely. Optimism bias. Optimism bias is one of the most pervasive and powerful cognitive biases affecting human behavior. We consistently believe that good things are more likely to happen to us than to others, while bad things are more likely to happen to others than to us. This isn't simply positive thinking. It's a systematic error in how we process probability and risk. The bias appears in countless areas of life. Students believe they'll finish assignments earlier than they actually do, leading to chronic procrastination and last-minute rushes. Homeowners underestimate renovation costs and timelines, turning simple projects into major ordeals. Investors believe they can beat the market despite overwhelming evidence that most cannot. In each case, optimism bias leads to poor planning and unrealistic expectations. One of the most studied areas is health behavior. People know that smoking causes cancer, that obesity increases health risks, and that excessive drinking damages the liver. Yet they often believe these risks apply more to others than to themselves. Sure, smoking is dangerous, they think, but I'll quit before any real damage occurs. Or, those statistics are about other people. I'm different. This optimism about personal health risks contributes to many preventable diseases and deaths. The planning fallacy represents a specific form of optimism bias with enormous practical consequences. When estimating how long projects will take, people consistently underestimate duration while accurately estimating timelines for similar projects done by others. This affects everything from construction projects that run over budget and behind schedule to personal goals that never get completed. Entrepreneurship showcases optimism bias dramatically. Studies show that over 80% of entrepreneurs believe their businesses have a better than 70% chance of success, even though actual success rates for new businesses are much lower. This optimism drives innovation and economic growth by encouraging people to start businesses they might avoid if they accurately assess the risks. But it also leads to financial ruin for many who invest their life savings in ventures with poor prospects. The bias affects romantic relationships too. People consistently overestimate the likelihood that their relationships will succeed and underestimate the probability of breakup or divorce. This optimism helps couples commit to each other and work through difficulties, but it can also lead to poor relationship decisions and inadequate preparation for potential problems. Financial planning suffers from optimism bias in multiple ways. People underestimate how much money they'll need for retirement while overestimating their future earning capacity. They assume their investments will perform better than historical averages while their expenses will remain controlled. This leads to inadequate savings and unrealistic financial goals. Interestingly, optimism bias isn't just about probability, it's also about timing. People tend to believe that good things will happen to them sooner than they actually do, while bad things will happen later or not at all. This affects everything from career expectations to health planning. The bias serves important psychological functions. Optimism motivates us to pursue goals, take necessary risks, and persevere through difficulties. Without some degree of optimism bias, many people might become paralyzed by life's genuine uncertainties and dangers. The belief that things will work out helps us get up each morning and tackle challenges that might otherwise seem overwhelming. Optimism bias also contributes to better mental health and resilience. People with moderate optimism bias tend to be happier, less anxious, and more willing to take on challenges that lead to growth and achievement. They recover more quickly from setbacks and are more likely to maintain relationships during difficult periods. But excessive optimism creates significant problems too. It leads to inadequate preparation for negative events, poor risk management, and unrealistic goal setting. People might fail to buy insurance, save for emergencies, or develop backup plans because they underestimate the likelihood of problems occurring. The halo effect. The halo effect is our tendency to let one positive trait or impression influence our opinions about other unrelated traits. When we like something about a person, product, or company, we tend to assume other good things about them too. That initial positive impression creates a cognitive halo that makes everything else about them seem better than it might actually be. This bias shapes countless daily interactions. When you meet someone who's physically attractive, you might unconsciously assume they're also intelligent, kind, and competent, even before they've demonstrated these qualities. Teachers who think a student is bright may grade their work more generously, while employers who are impressed by a candidate's credentials might overlook weaknesses in their interview performance. The business world provides countless examples of the halo effect in action. When a company performs well financially, everything about it suddenly looks brilliant: their strategy, leadership, corporate culture, and innovation. Business magazines write glowing profiles explaining exactly why the company is so successful, but when the same company later struggles, those previously praised qualities get reframed as weaknesses. The visionary CEO becomes reckless, the innovative culture becomes unfocused, and the bold strategy becomes risky. Consider how this affected perceptions of tech companies during the dot-com boom. Companies with rising stock prices were praised for everything: their office designs, hiring practices, management philosophies, and corporate cultures. When the bubble burst, these same companies were criticized for the exact same practices that had previously been celebrated. The companies hadn't fundamentally changed, only the financial halo had dimmed. Brand perception demonstrates the halo effect powerfully. Apple's reputation for elegant design creates a halo that makes their products seem more innovative, user-friendly, and reliable than they might objectively be. Customers expect Apple products to just work, partly because of this halo, while identical problems with other brands might be seen as typical corporate incompetence. The effect extends to hiring decisions in dangerous ways. Research shows that physically attractive job candidates receive higher ratings for competence and intelligence, even when qualifications are identical. Tall people are more likely to be seen as leadership material. Candidates from prestigious universities get the benefit of the doubt that others don't receive. These initial positive impressions create halos that influence every subsequent judgment. Celebrity endorsements exploit the halo effect systematically. When a famous athlete endorses a product, their success in sports creates a halo that makes them seem more credible about completely unrelated topics like breakfast cereal or financial services. We unconsciously transfer our positive feelings about their athletic ability to their supposed expertise in other areas. The halo effect appears in how we judge countries, cities, and institutions too. A country with a strong economy might be praised for its educational system, healthcare, and social policies, even when these areas have serious problems. A university with a prestigious reputation gets the benefit of the doubt in ways that less famous institutions don't. Personal relationships aren't immune. In romantic relationships, the initial attraction or positive qualities that drew us to someone can create a halo that makes us overlook or minimize their flaws. We might interpret their stubbornness as determination or their recklessness as spontaneity because the overall halo remains positive. What makes the halo effect particularly problematic is that it prevents us from making accurate, nuanced judgments. Instead of evaluating each trait or quality independently, we let one strong impression color everything else. This can lead to poor hiring decisions, misguided investments, and unrealistic expectations in relationships. The effect also works in reverse with what psychologists call the horn effect, when one negative trait creates a dark cloud that makes everything else seem worse. But we'll explore that phenomenon separately. Social media amplifies halo effects dramatically. A single viral success can create an enormous halo around a person or brand, leading to opportunities and endorsements far beyond their actual expertise. Conversely, one public mistake can destroy a previously positive halo almost instantly. The horn effect. Horn effect operates as the flip side of the halo effect's coin. Where halos make us see virtue everywhere, horns make us see vice. Once we form a negative impression in one area, we unconsciously expect negative qualities in all other areas too. That one bad trait becomes a lens through which we interpret everything else, often unfairly. Consider how this plays out in job interviews. A candidate who arrives 5 minutes late might be seen as disorganized, unreliable, and disrespectful, even if traffic was genuinely unpredictable and their credentials are otherwise impressive. That initial negative impression creates a horn effect that makes the interviewer interpret every subsequent interaction more negatively. Hesitation becomes ignorance, questions become incompetence, and enthusiasm becomes desperation. The workplace provides countless examples of the horn effect in action. An employee who makes one significant mistake might find that their previous achievements are suddenly forgotten or minimized. Colleagues and supervisors begin interpreting their actions through the lens of that single failure. Their careful work gets dismissed as obvious, their creative suggestions get seen as risky, and their collaborative efforts get viewed as needing oversight. Academic settings aren't immune. Students who perform poorly on an early assignment often struggle with the horn effect for the rest of the semester. Teachers unconsciously expect less from them, grade their work more harshly, and interpret their contributions to class discussions less charitably. The initial poor performance creates a negative halo that affects every subsequent evaluation. The phenomenon appears dramatically in how we judge public figures. One scandal or mistake can completely transform public perception of a previously admired person. Suddenly, past achievements get reframed as lucky breaks, previous charitable work gets seen as calculated public relations moves, and every action gets interpreted through the lens of the negative revelation. The horn effect can destroy decades of reputation building in a matter of days. Corporate examples abound as well. When a company faces a major crisis, a product recall, environmental disaster, or ethical scandal, everything about the organization suddenly seems suspect. The same corporate practices that were previously ignored or praised become evidence of systemic problems. Their marketing seems manipulative, their leadership appears incompetent, and their corporate culture looks toxic. The horn effect transforms every aspect of the company's image. Consider how this affected Volkswagen after their emissions scandal. Suddenly, their engineering excellence was reframed as deceptive manipulation. Their German precision became Teutonic arrogance, and their marketing messages seemed like cynical lies. The horn effect made it difficult to see anything positive about the company, even aspects completely unrelated to the scandal. The effect extends to how we judge entire groups and categories. One bad experience with a restaurant might make you suspicious of the entire chain. A negative encounter with a representative from a company can taint your perception of all their products and services. Meeting one rude person from a particular city might unconsciously influence how you view everyone from that place. Personal relationships suffer from horn effects too. In romantic relationships, one major fight or disappointment can create a negative filter that makes every subsequent interaction seem more problematic. Partners begin interpreting neutral actions as passive-aggressive, good intentions as manipulative, and attempts at reconciliation as insincere. The horn effect can accelerate relationship deterioration by making it harder to see positive qualities that are still there. Social media amplifies horn effects dramatically. A single controversial tweet or Facebook post can destroy someone's reputation, regardless of their other contributions or character. The speed and permanence of digital communication mean that horn effects can form quickly and persist indefinitely, following people across jobs, relationships, and life stages. What makes the horn effect particularly dangerous is its self-reinforcing nature. Once we expect negative things from someone or something, we pay more attention to evidence that confirms our negative impression while overlooking positive evidence. This creates a downward spiral where our expectations lead us to notice more problems, which reinforces our negative expectations. The effect also influences memory in problematic ways. We tend to remember negative incidents more vividly than positive ones when the horn effect is active. That one rude comment from a colleague might be remembered clearly while dozens of helpful interactions fade from memory. Hindsight Bias. Hindsight bias, also known as the "I knew it all along" effect, is our tendency to perceive past events as more predictable than they were at the time they occurred. Once we know an outcome, our brains automatically reorganize the preceding information to make that outcome seem inevitable, causing us to overestimate how predictable the event was. This isn't simply a matter of faulty memory. It's a fundamental feature of how our minds process information. When an outcome becomes known, our brains instantly begin rewriting history, emphasizing factors that led to that outcome while downplaying or forgetting information that suggested other possibilities. The effect was first systematically studied by psychologist Baruch Fischhoff In one classic experiment, participants read about historical events and were asked to predict their outcomes. Later, after learning what actually happened, they were asked to recall their original predictions. Consistently, people remembered being more confident about the actual outcome than they really were. Their brains had unconsciously edited their memories to align with reality. Consider how this plays out in investing. When a stock crashes, investors suddenly remember all the warning signs that now seem obvious: the company's declining margins, the CEO's questionable statements, the industry's structural challenges. But before the crash, these same investors held onto their shares, suggesting these warning signs weren't as clear as they now appear in hindsight. Sports provide endless examples of hindsight bias. After an upset victory, commentators explain exactly why the underdog won, citing factors that were apparent all along. The winning strategy seems brilliant in retrospect, while the losing approach appears obviously flawed. But before the game, the same experts often predicted the opposite outcome. Medical professionals struggle with hindsight bias too. After a patient's condition worsens, doctors may feel they should have seen it coming, even when the original symptoms were genuinely ambiguous. This can lead to defensive medicine, ordering excessive tests to avoid the future regret of missing something that might seem obvious in hindsight. The bias is particularly dangerous in learning environments. Students who know the answer to a problem often can't understand why others find it difficult. The solution seems self-evident once you know it. Teachers may underestimate how challenging concepts are for students because they've forgotten their own initial confusion. Hindsight bias affects legal decisions profoundly. Juries evaluating negligence cases must decide whether defendants should have foreseen harmful consequences. But knowing that harm actually occurred makes those consequences seem more predictable than they were at the time. This can lead to unfair judgments against defendants who made reasonable decisions given the information available to them. The business world sees this constantly. When companies fail, business analysts write detailed postmortems, explaining exactly why the failure was inevitable. The warning signs seem crystal clear in retrospect. But if these signs were truly obvious, why didn't the market respond earlier? Why didn't competitors avoid similar mistakes? Hindsight bias creates several problematic outcomes. First, it makes us overconfident in our ability to predict future events. If past outcomes seem obvious in retrospect, we assume future outcomes will be equally predictable. Second, it leads to unfair evaluation of past decisions. We judge decision-makers harshly for not anticipating outcomes that only seem obvious now that we know what happened. The bias also impedes learning. When we view past events as inevitable, we don't properly analyze the uncertainty and complexity that existed at the time. This prevents us from understanding the true causes of success and failure, making us likely to repeat mistakes or misunderstand our successes. Pessimism bias. While optimism bias gets most of the attention in psychology research, its darker counterpart, pessimism bias, affects millions of people and deserves equal consideration. Pessimism bias is our tendency to overestimate the likelihood of negative events while underestimating positive outcomes. Where optimism bias sees the world through rose-colored glasses, pessimism bias views it through a dark filter that makes threats seem larger and opportunities smaller than they actually are. Unlike optimism bias, which appears to be the default human setting, pessimism bias often develops through experience, trauma, or certain mental health conditions. It's not simply being realistic about risks, it's systematically skewing probability assessments in a negative direction, just as optimism bias skews them positively. Consider how pessimism bias affects career decisions. While optimistically biased people might underestimate the challenges of starting a business, pessimistically biased individuals might overestimate the risks of leaving a secure job, even when better opportunities await. They focus intensely on what could go wrong: market downturns, competition, personal inadequacy, while giving insufficient weight to potential benefits. The bias appears dramatically in health anxiety. People with pessimism bias might interpret minor symptoms as signs of serious illness, overestimate their likelihood of developing diseases, and underestimate the effectiveness of treatments. Every headache becomes a potential brain tumor. Every chest pain suggests heart disease. This hypervigilance about health threats can lead to excessive medical testing, avoidance of physical activity, and chronic stress that actually harms health. Investment decisions suffer when pessimism bias takes hold. While optimistically biased investors might take excessive risks, pessimistically biased ones might avoid reasonable investments altogether. They focus on market crashes, corporate scandals, and economic downturns while underweighting the historical tendency of diversified investments to grow over time. This can lead to keeping too much money in low-yield savings accounts, missing decades of potential growth. Relationships feel the impact of pessimism bias too. People with this bias might overestimate the likelihood of rejection, betrayal, or abandonment, while underestimating their own lovability and the genuine affection others feel for them. They might interpret neutral behaviors as signs of disapproval, assume friendships are more fragile than they are, and avoid romantic relationships to prevent anticipated heartbreak. The bias creates self-fulfilling prophecies in troubling ways. Expecting negative outcomes can lead to behaviors that make those outcomes more likely. The person who expects to fail a job interview might prepare less thoroughly, creating the poor performance they anticipated. Someone who assumes others will reject them might act distant or defensive, pushing people away and confirming their negative expectations. Academic and professional performance can suffer under pessimism bias. Students might underestimate their ability to succeed in challenging courses, leading them to avoid opportunities for growth. Workers might assume they're not qualified for promotions, preventing them from applying for positions they could actually handle. The bias becomes a ceiling on achievement, limiting what people attempt based on inflated assessments of failure risk. Interestingly, pessimism bias can sometimes masquerade as realism or wisdom. People with this bias often pride themselves on seeing things as they really are, or being prepared for the worst. But just as optimism bias isn't actually realistic, neither is systematic pessimism. Both represent distortions of objective probability assessment. The media environment can reinforce pessimism bias, just as it can fuel other cognitive distortions. News organizations know that negative stories capture attention more effectively than positive ones. If it bleeds, it leads creates a steady stream of disasters, crimes, and crises that can make the world seem more dangerous than statistical reality suggests. Heavy news consumption can feed pessimistic worldviews by providing an endless supply of vivid, negative examples. Social media compounds this effect by creating echo chambers where pessimistic content gets shared and amplified. Doom scrolling through feeds filled with political outrage, environmental disasters, and personal tragedies can reinforce the belief that things are getting worse everywhere, even when many objective measures of human welfare show improvement over time. Pessimism bias isn't always problematic. It can provide valuable counterbalances to excessive optimism and help people prepare for genuine risks. Actor-observer bias. Actor-observer bias describes how we explain behavior differently depending on whether we're the actor performing the behavior or an observer watching someone else. When we're the actor, we tend to attribute our behavior to situational factors, the circumstances we face, the pressures we're under, the options available to us. When we're observers, we tend to attribute others' behavior to dispositional factors, their personality, character, or inherent traits. This bias emerges from fundamental differences in perspective and information availability. As actors in our own lives, we have intimate knowledge of our circumstances, motivations, and constraints. We know when we're tired, stressed, or facing unusual pressures. We're acutely aware of the situational factors influencing our decisions. But when observing others, we can't see their internal states or fully appreciate their circumstances. What we can see is their behavior, making it natural to assume that behavior reflects who they are rather than the situation they're in. Consider how this plays out in workplace evaluations. When you miss a deadline, you know about the competing priorities, the unclear instructions from management, or the personal issues that consumed your attention. Your lateness feels circumstantial, something that happened to you rather than something that defines you. But when a coworker misses deadlines, you might conclude they're unreliable, disorganized, or don't care about quality work. The bias appears in how we judge driving behavior. When you cut someone off in traffic, You know you're running late to pick up your child from daycare. The situational pressure makes your aggressive driving feel justified. But when someone cuts you off, you can't see their circumstances. Their behavior seems to reflect their character as an inconsiderate, reckless driver. Academic settings provide countless examples. When students perform poorly on exams, they often cite external factors. The test was unfair, the material wasn't covered adequately, they had too many exams that week. But professors observing the same poor performance might attribute it to internal factors. The student didn't study hard enough, lacks ability, or doesn't take the class seriously. Both perspectives contain partial truth, but each emphasizes different causal factors. The bias significantly affects how we judge moral behavior. When we make ethical compromises, telling small lies, breaking minor rules, or acting selfishly, we typically have ready explanations involving circumstances, competing loyalties, or impossible situations. We remain good people who face difficult choices. But when we observe others making similar compromises, we're more likely to judge their character harshly, seeing their behavior as reflecting their moral fiber rather than their circumstances. Relationships suffer when actor-observer bias creates misunderstandings between partners. When you forget an anniversary, you might think about work stress, busy schedules, or lack of planning skills, situational factors that don't reflect your feelings for your partner. But your partner, observing your forgetfulness, might conclude you don't care about the relationship or don't value important milestones. Both of you are drawing reasonable conclusions from your different perspectives, but neither fully understands the other's viewpoint. The bias extends to how we view success and failure across different domains. When entrepreneurs succeed, they often attribute their success to market conditions, timing, team support, or lucky breaks, external factors they happen to benefit from. But when we observe successful entrepreneurs, we tend to focus on their vision, determination, and business acumen, internal qualities that seem to explain their achievements. Social media amplifies actor-observer bias by providing limited glimpses into others' lives while giving us full access to our own internal experiences. We see others' highlight reels, their successes, adventures, and positive moments, without understanding the circumstances, struggles, or luck that contributed to those outcomes. Meanwhile, we know intimately the efforts, challenges, and external factors behind our own achievements and failures. Political behavior showcases the bias dramatically. When members of our preferred political party make compromises or change positions, we understand the complex political pressures, constituency demands, and strategic considerations involved. When opposing party members do the same things, we see flip-flopping, weakness, or lack of principles. The same behavior gets explained situationally for our side and dispositionally for theirs. Actor-observer bias reminds us that perspective shapes understanding in fundamental ways. We are all simultaneously the heroes of our own stories and supporting characters in others' narratives. Fundamental attribution error. In 1967, psychologists Edward Jones and Victor Harris conducted an experiment that revealed something unsettling about human judgment. They asked participants to read essays either supporting or opposing Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba. Some readers were told the essay writers had freely chosen their position, while others learned the writers were assigned their stance by the experimenter. Logic suggests that when someone is forced to argue a position, their essay tells us nothing about their true beliefs. But that's not what happened. Even when participants knew the writers had no choice in their position, they still judged pro-Castro essay writers as more sympathetic to Castro and anti-Castro writers as more opposed. They attributed the essays to the writers' genuine beliefs, rather than to the situational constraint of the assignment. This tendency to overemphasize personality and underemphasize situations when explaining others' behavior became known as the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error is our systematic tendency to attribute other people's actions to their character, personality, or internal dispositions, while underestimating the role of external circumstances. When someone cuts us off in traffic, we think, "What a jerk," rather than considering they might be rushing to the hospital. When a cashier seems rude, we assume they're an unpleasant person rather than considering they might be having the worst day of their lives. This bias is so pervasive that it affects how we understand virtually every human interaction we observe. It's not simply a thinking error. It's a fundamental feature of how our minds process social information, with profound implications for everything from criminal justice to workplace management to personal relationships. Consider how fundamental attribution error affects our judgments in the workplace. When a colleague misses deadlines, we're likely to conclude they're disorganized, lazy, or don't care about quality work. We focus on their character rather than considering potential situational factors, unclear instructions, competing priorities, inadequate resources, personal crises, or unrealistic expectations. This attribution to character can persist even when we later learn about the situational constraints they faced. The criminal justice system provides stark examples of how fundamental attribution error can have serious consequences. Juries often assume that defendants' past behavior reflects their essential character rather than their circumstances. Someone with a history of theft gets viewed as inherently dishonest rather than as someone who may have faced desperate situations. This character-based thinking can lead to harsher punishments that focus on who the person supposedly is rather than what circumstances led to their actions. Educational settings show the bias clearly too. When students perform poorly, teachers often attribute failure to internal factors like lack of motivation, poor study habits, or limited ability. They may give insufficient consideration to external factors like family problems, learning disabilities, economic stress, or inadequate prior education. These attributions can become self-fulfilling prophecies as students internalize others' character-based explanations for their performance. The bias appears in how we judge people experiencing homelessness, poverty, or addiction. Rather than considering the complex web of economic, social, and biological factors that contribute to these conditions, many people make character-based attributions. Homeless people are lazy, poor people lack initiative, addicts have weak willpower. These oversimplified explanations ignore the powerful situational forces that influence human behavior. Fundamental attribution error affects our understanding of success as well as failure. When we see successful people, we tend to attribute their achievements to internal qualities like intelligence, hard work, or talent, while underestimating external factors like supportive families, educational opportunities, economic conditions, or simple luck. This can lead to the belief that success is purely a matter of character, ignoring the role of privilege and circumstance. The bias is particularly strong when we're observing behavior that seems obviously wrong or irrational. When someone makes a decision we consider foolish, our first instinct is to question their judgment, intelligence, or values, rather than to consider what information they might have had, what pressures they faced, or what alternatives were available to them. In-group bias. The tendency to favor members of our own group over outsiders is called in-group bias, and it represents one of the most fundamental features of human psychology. We automatically categorize the world into us and them, then systematically treat members of our own groups more favorably than members of other groups, even when group membership is arbitrary and provides no logical basis for preferential treatment. In-group bias appears everywhere in human society. Sports fans feel genuine joy when their team wins and real sadness when it loses, despite having no personal involvement in the player's performance. They refer to victories as "we won" and defeats as "they lost," psychologically identifying with people they've never met, based solely on shared team allegiance. This emotional investment in group success extends far beyond logical self-interest. The workplace showcases in-group bias constantly. Employees favor colleagues from their own departments, viewing them as more competent, trustworthy, and deserving of resources than people from other divisions. Sales teams think marketing doesn't understand customers. Engineers believe salespeople overpromise and underdeliver. Each group sees itself as essential while viewing other groups as obstacles or support functions. Academic institutions demonstrate powerful in-group biases. Students develop fierce loyalty to their schools, believing their institution provides superior education and produces better graduates than rival universities. Alumni donate money and volunteer time based on this group identification, maintaining emotional connections to institutions they attended decades earlier. School pride becomes part of personal identity. Political affiliation creates some of the strongest in-group biases in modern society. People view members of their own political party as more intelligent, moral, and patriotic than members of opposing parties. They interpret identical policies more favorably when proposed by their own party and more critically when suggested by opponents. Political identity becomes so central to self-concept that criticism of party leaders feels like personal attacks. Religious communities show similar patterns. Members of religious groups tend to see their own faith as more true, moral, and beneficial than other religions. They're more likely to trust, help, and socialize with fellow believers than with members of other faiths or non-believers. These preferences persist even when religious teachings explicitly emphasize universal love and acceptance. National identity creates in-group biases that shape international relations. People consistently rate their own countries as more democratic, peaceful, and moral than other nations. They remember their country's virtuous actions while forgetting or minimizing historical wrongs. This national in-group bias can make international cooperation difficult and contribute to conflicts based on group identity rather than genuine interests. The bias extends to seemingly trivial categorizations too. People show favoritism based on arbitrary groupings like birth month, last name, alphabetical order, or randomly assigned team colors. These minimal group studies demonstrate that humans will create in-group preferences based on virtually any distinction, no matter how meaningless. In-group bias serves several psychological functions. It provides a sense of belonging and identity in a complex world. Knowing which group you belong to helps answer fundamental questions about who you are and where you fit in society. Group membership offers emotional support, shared values, and collective meaning that individuals often struggle to create on their own. The bias also serves practical functions by facilitating cooperation within groups. When people trust and favor group members, they're more willing to share resources, provide help, and work together toward common goals. These cooperative advantages may have provided evolutionary benefits to groups with strong in-group loyalty. But in-group bias creates serious problems too. It leads to discrimination against outsiders, even when such discrimination serves no logical purpose and harms overall social welfare. Resources get allocated based on group membership rather than merit or need. Qualified individuals get excluded from opportunities simply because they belong to the wrong groups. The bias can escalate into more serious forms of prejudice and conflict. When groups compete for resources or status, in-group bias can intensify into out-group hostility. Members of other groups become not just less favored, but actively disliked or seen as threats. This can contribute to workplace conflicts, political polarization, and even ethnic violence. Out-group homogeneity bias. The out-group homogeneity bias is the flip side of in-group bias. While in-group bias makes us favor our own group members, out-group homogeneity bias makes us see other groups as lacking the diversity and individuality we readily recognize within our own groups. We perceive fine-grained differences among people we know well, while lumping outsiders into broad, undifferentiated categories. This bias emerges from simple differences in exposure and attention. We interact frequently with members of our own groups, giving us detailed knowledge of their individual personalities, opinions, and behaviors. We see the quiet introvert and the loud extrovert, the moderate and the extremist, the reliable performer and the occasional troublemaker. This familiarity reveals the natural diversity that exists within any group of humans. But our contact with other groups is typically more limited and superficial. We encounter out-group members in specific contexts, often when group membership is particularly salient. We might see protesters from an opposing political movement, customers from a different demographic, or students from a rival school. These limited interactions don't reveal the full range of individual differences that exist within those groups. The bias shows up dramatically in how different generations view each other. Older adults often describe younger generations in sweeping terms. Millennials are all entitled and lazy, or Generation Z kids are all addicted to their phones. Meanwhile, younger people might characterize older generations as uniformly resistant to change or out of touch with modern realities. Each group sees rich diversity within itself, while perceiving the other as monolithic. Political contexts showcase out-group homogeneity bias powerfully. Conservatives tend to see liberals as uniformly holding identical progressive views, while liberals often perceive conservatives as sharing identical traditional positions. In reality, both groups contain wide spectrums of opinion, but these internal differences become invisible across party lines. Democrats see nuanced differences between progressive and moderate Democrats while viewing all Republicans as the same. Republicans recognize distinctions between libertarian and social conservatives, while seeing all Democrats as identical liberals. The workplace provides countless examples of this bias in action. Management views employees as more similar to each other than employees actually are, often assuming that what motivates one worker will motivate all workers. Similarly, employees tend to view managers as a homogeneous group with identical interests and perspectives, missing the real disagreements and different approaches that exist among leaders. Professional stereotypes reflect outgroup homogeneity bias too. People outside the legal profession often view all lawyers as equally aggressive, greedy, or unethical, missing the vast differences in personality, values, and practice styles among attorneys. Those outside academia might see all professors as similarly absent-minded or impractical, while those outside business might view all executives as equally ruthless or money-focused. The bias affects how we perceive different cultures and nationalities. Americans might see all Europeans as more sophisticated, all Asians as more academically focused, or all Middle Easterners as more religious, failing to recognize the enormous diversity within these broad regional categories. These overgeneralizations can lead to both positive and negative stereotypes, but in both cases they mask important individual differences. Sports fandom demonstrates the bias clearly. Fans of rival teams often see opposing fans as uniformly obnoxious, unsportsmanlike, or ignorant about the game, while recognizing that their own fan base includes both knowledgeable enthusiasts and casual observers, both gracious winners and poor losers. The complexity they see in their own group becomes invisible when looking at rival fans. Outgroup homogeneity bias contributes to prejudice and discrimination by making it easier to apply negative stereotypes to entire groups. When we see outgroup members as essentially interchangeable, we're more likely to assume that negative traits observed in some members apply to all members. This can justify discriminatory policies or individual biases that treat people as representatives of their groups rather than as unique individuals. Status quo bias. Status quo bias represents one of the most powerful forces in human decision-making, yet it often operates below the threshold of conscious awareness. We systematically favor existing states of affairs, current options, and familiar arrangements over alternatives, even when those alternatives might objectively serve our interests better. The bias manifests not through active preference for the current situation, but through inaction and resistance to change. The phenomenon appears everywhere in daily life. Consider subscription services. Many people continue paying for gym memberships they never use, streaming services they rarely watch, or magazine subscriptions. They don't read simply because canceling requires active effort. Companies understand this bias and deliberately make cancellation processes difficult while auto-renewing services by default. They profit from our tendency to stick with whatever is already in place. Investment behavior showcases status quo bias dramatically. Many employees never adjust their retirement plan contributions or investment allocations from the initial default settings, even when those defaults clearly don't match their age, risk tolerance, or financial goals. They leave money in low-yield savings accounts rather than exploring better alternatives. They hold on to losing stocks longer than winning ones, maintaining positions that no longer make sense rather than making changes that would improve their portfolios. The bias affects major life decisions too. People often stay in unsatisfying jobs, relationships, or living situations, not because they're happy with them, but because changing seems too difficult or risky compared to maintaining the familiar status quo. They know their current situation isn't optimal, but the effort and uncertainty of change feel more daunting than the known problems of staying put. Consumer choices reflect status quo bias in countless ways. People tend to choose default options on websites, stick with the same brands they've always used, and continue patronizing familiar businesses, even when competitors offer better value. They order the same items at restaurants, take the same routes to work, and maintain the same daily routines, partly from habit and partly from bias toward existing patterns. Political and social contexts show the bias clearly too. Voters often support incumbent politicians and existing policies not because they're entirely satisfied, but because change seems risky or uncertain. Social institutions persist long after their original purposes have been served, maintained by collective status quo bias that makes reform seem more dangerous than preservation of familiar arrangements. The bias emerges from several psychological sources. Loss aversion plays a major role. Changes involve giving up current benefits or familiar arrangements, and our brains weigh potential losses more heavily than equivalent gains. The endowment effect makes us value things more highly simply because we already possess them. Uncertainty aversion makes unknown alternatives seem riskier than familiar problems. Cognitive load also contributes to status quo bias. Making changes requires mental effort to evaluate alternatives, weigh trade-offs, and implement new arrangements. When people are busy, stressed, or cognitively overloaded, they're more likely to stick with existing options simply because change requires energy they don't have available. Status quo bias can serve adaptive functions by providing stability and reducing decision-making costs. Constantly reevaluating every choice would be mentally exhausting and might prevent focus on more important matters. Some resistance to change helps maintain beneficial arrangements and prevents impulsive decisions that might be regretted later. But the bias creates significant problems too. It can trap people in suboptimal situations that gradually worsen over time. It prevents adaptation to changing circumstances that require new approaches. It can perpetuate inefficient systems, unfair arrangements, and outdated practices that serve some interests while harming others. Organizations often struggle with institutional status quo bias that makes necessary changes difficult to implement. Companies stick with obsolete technologies, inefficient processes, and counterproductive policies because that's how we've always done things. This organizational inertia can prevent adaptation to changing markets and competitive threats. The bias affects social progress by creating resistance to beneficial reforms. Even when majority of people support changes to laws, policies, or social arrangements, status quo bias creates practical obstacles to implementation. The effort required to change existing systems often exceeds the motivation available, even when people intellectually support reform. Endowment effect. The endowment effect challenges fundamental assumptions of economic theory about rational decision-making. Traditional economics assumes that an object's value to you should be the same whether you own it or not. After all, the item itself hasn't changed. But psychology reveals that ownership itself creates additional value in our minds, making us reluctant to trade things we possess, even when doing so would be objectively beneficial. The effect appears everywhere in everyday life. Homeowners typically believe their houses are worth more than real estate markets suggest, partly because ownership has inflated their perception of value. They remember every improvement they've made, every dollar they've invested, and every positive experience in the space. Potential buyers, lacking this psychological attachment, see the same house more objectively and often make lower offers that feel insulting to owners but reflect fair market value. Car ownership demonstrates the endowment effect powerfully. People often maintain emotional attachments to vehicles long after they've become expensive to maintain or unsuited to their needs. They remember the car's good years, the places it's taken them, and the money they've invested in repairs. Selling feels like losing something valuable, even when replacement vehicles would be more reliable and economical. The bias affects financial decisions in costly ways. Investors often hold on to losing stocks longer than they should because selling means accepting that their investment has lost value. They hope losing positions will recover rather than cutting losses and reinvesting in better opportunities. This reluctance to sell losers while readily selling winners, the opposite of sound investment strategy, reflects endowment effect thinking. Employment relationships show the effect too. Employees often overvalue their current jobs, focusing on familiar benefits, established relationships, and accumulated seniority, while undervaluing potentially better opportunities elsewhere. The salary, benefits, and working conditions they currently have feel more valuable than identical or even superior packages offered by other employers. Consumer behavior reflects endowment effect in countless ways. People resist switching banks, insurance companies, or service providers even when competitors offer better terms. The accounts, policies, and arrangements they already have feel more valuable than alternatives, partly because they own them, and partly because switching requires giving up familiar arrangements. The effect becomes particularly strong when ownership involves effort or personal investment. Items we've built, created, or customized feel more valuable than identical items we could simply purchase. The bookshelf you assembled yourself seems more valuable than an identical factory-made one. The garden you've cultivated feels more precious than professional landscaping. This IKEA effect, named after the furniture store where customers assemble their own purchases, shows how effort enhances the endowment effect. Digital ownership triggers similar psychological responses despite having no physical component. People develop attachments to online accounts, virtual assets in games, and digital collections that have no tangible existence. They resist deleting old files, closing unused accounts, or abandoning virtual achievements because these digital possessions have become psychologically valuable through ownership. The endowment effect helps explain why free trials and money-back guarantees work so effectively as marketing strategies. Once potential customers take possession of products, even temporarily, they begin experiencing psychological ownership that makes returning or canceling feel like losing something valuable. Companies understand that possession shifts the decision from, should I acquire this, to, should I give this up? Real estate agents and car dealers exploit the endowment effect by encouraging potential buyers to imagine ownership before purchase. They use phrases like, your new kitchen, or your car during sales presentations. Test drives and home tours create temporary possession experiences that trigger endowment effects, making purchases feel like recovering something you're already losing, rather than acquiring something new. The bias can prevent beneficial changes and efficient resource allocation. People hold on to possessions they rarely use rather than selling them to others who would value them more highly. They maintain inefficient business arrangements because giving up current contracts feels like losing value. They resist organizational changes that would improve overall efficiency because current arrangements feel more valuable due to familiarity and psychological ownership. Sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy represents a fundamental error in decision-making logic. Past investments, whether of money, time, effort, or emotion, are gone forever and cannot be recovered. Economically rational decisions should be based only on future costs and benefits, not on historical expenditures. But psychologically, we feel that abandoning projects after significant investment means admitting failure and wasting everything we've put in. The fallacy appears everywhere in business decisions. Companies often continue funding failing projects, unprofitable product lines, or ineffective marketing campaigns because of previous investments rather than future potential. They upgrade obsolete computer systems rather than replacing them, renovate declining facilities rather than relocating, and persist with underperforming employees because of training investments. The logic becomes, we've invested too much to quit now, even when quitting would prevent even larger losses. Individual financial decisions fall prey to the sunk cost fallacy regularly. People continue expensive gym memberships they rarely use because they've already paid for several months. They finish college degrees in fields they no longer want to pursue because they've invested years in tuition money. They maintain costly car repairs on vehicles that would be cheaper to replace because they've already spent thousands on previous fixes. The stock market provides dramatic examples of sunk cost thinking. Investors often refuse to sell losing positions because doing so feels like confirming their losses and wasting their initial investment. They tell themselves, I can't sell now, I'm down 40%. I need to wait until it recovers. But the stock's future prospects have nothing to do with what the investor paid for it originally. Sometimes the best decision is cutting losses and reinvesting in better opportunities. Relationships suffer from sunk cost fallacy too. People often stay in unsatisfying romantic partnerships because they've invested years building the relationship, even when both parties would be happier apart. They think about the time, effort, and emotional energy they've devoted, rather than focusing on whether the relationship serves their future well-being. The logic becomes, we've been together for 5 years. We can't give up now, even when those 5 years might be better viewed as a learning experience rather than an investment requiring protection. Career decisions reflect the fallacy when people persist in unfulfilling jobs or career paths because of previous training and experience. They might think, I spent 4 years in medical school. I have to become a doctor, even when they've discovered medicine isn't right for them. The educational investment feels too large to abandon, but continuing down an unsuitable path often leads to decades of dissatisfaction. The phenomenon appears in how organizations handle failing employees too. Managers sometimes continue investing in training and support for consistently underperforming workers because they've already spent considerable resources on them. Rather than acknowledging that some hiring decisions don't work out and moving on, they double down on previous investments, hoping additional effort will somehow justify past expenditures. Major infrastructure projects demonstrate sunk cost fallacy on enormous scales. Governments continue funding over-budget, behind-schedule projects, partly because cancellation would mean admitting that previous spending was wasted. The Berlin-Brandenburg Airport, mentioned earlier in our discussion of optimism bias, exemplifies this pattern. Delays and cost overruns continued for years, partly because too much had already been invested to consider alternatives. Entertainment spending shows the fallacy in everyday situations. People sit through boring movies because they paid for tickets, even though leaving would free up time for more enjoyable activities. They continue reading books they're not enjoying because they've already invested hours in the story. They attend expensive events they're not having fun at because the admission fee is already paid. The sunk cost fallacy becomes particularly dangerous when combined with other cognitive biases. Confirmation bias makes people seek evidence that their continued investment will pay off while ignoring signs of continued failure. Optimism bias makes future success seem more likely than it actually. Island status quo bias creates resistance to the change that abandoning sunk costs would require. What makes the sunk cost fallacy so persistent is that occasionally, continued investment does eventually pay off. Some struggling businesses eventually become successful. Some difficult relationships do improve over time. These occasional positive outcomes create intermittent reinforcement that encourages sunk cost thinking, even though continuing to invest in failing ventures usually leads to larger loss. Loss aversion. Imagine two scenarios. In the first, someone gives you $50. In the second, someone gives you $100, but then takes away $50. In both cases, you end up $50 richer than when you started. Logic suggests you should feel equally good about both outcomes. After all, your net financial position is identical. But if you're like most people, the second scenario would feel worse, even though it leaves you exactly as well off as the first. This illustrates one of the most powerful and pervasive biases in human psychology, loss aversion. Simply put, losses feel roughly twice as painful as equivalent gains feel pleasurable. The pain of losing $100 outweighs the joy of gaining $100 by a significant margin. This asymmetry in how we experience gains and losses profoundly shapes decision-making, often leading us to make choices that prioritize avoiding losses over pursuing equivalent or even larger gains. Loss aversion evolved for good reasons. In our ancestral environment, losing resources often had more serious survival consequences than gaining additional ones. The difference between having enough food and not having enough could mean life or death, while the difference between having enough and having plenty might not matter much for survival. Natural selection favored brains that paid special attention to potential losses, even at the cost of missed opportunities for gains. But in modern contexts, this ancient wisdom often leads us astray. Loss aversion affects investment behavior in costly ways. Investors often hold on to losing stocks too long, hoping to avoid realizing losses, while selling winning stocks too quickly to lock in gains. This disposition effect leads to portfolios filled with losers and empty of winners, exactly the opposite of sound investment strategy. The bias shows up dramatically in how people respond to market volatility. During market downturns, investors often panic and sell at low prices to avoid further losses, even when long-term investment strategies would suggest staying the course. The pain of watching portfolio values decline feels more intense than the potential pleasure of future gains, leading to emotional decisions that harm long-term wealth building. Employment negotiations reveal loss aversion clearly too. People often focus more on avoiding benefit reductions than on securing salary increases of equivalent value. They might fight harder to prevent the loss of a small perk than to gain a larger but unfamiliar benefit. Employers understand this bias and sometimes structure offers to emphasize what employees would lose by leaving rather than what they would gain by staying. Real estate transactions showcase loss aversion powerfully. Homeowners often refuse to sell properties for less than they paid, even when holding onto them costs more than the paper loss they're avoiding. They focus on their original purchase price as a reference point and experience prices below that level as losses to be avoided, even when current market value suggests selling would be wise. The effect appears in how people make consumer choices too. Free trials work partly because canceling feels like losing something you've grown accustomed to having. Return policies reduce purchase anxiety by making buying feel reversible, but many people end up keeping items they're not entirely happy with because returning them feels like actively choosing to lose something they possess. Loss aversion influences how people respond to changes in ongoing arrangements. Employee resistance to benefit changes often focuses more on what's being taken away than on what might be gained. Citizens oppose tax increases more vigorously than they support equivalent spending cuts. Customers react more strongly to price increases than to equivalent service reductions. The bias affects risk assessment in systematic ways. People tend to be more motivated by avoiding negative outcomes than by achieving positive ones of similar magnitude. Safety messages that emphasize what you'll lose by not taking precautions often prove more effective than messages emphasizing what you'll gain by being careful. Healthcare decisions may focus more on avoiding the worst-case scenarios than on optimizing for the best possible outcomes. Negotiations reflect loss aversion when people anchor on what they currently have and resist giving up any component, even in exchange for more valuable benefits. Labor negotiations often stall over attempts to reduce existing benefits, even when total compensation packages increase. Divorce settlements may focus more on preventing the ex-spouse from gaining assets than on maximizing one's own outcomes. The phenomenon extends beyond financial and material losses to social and emotional ones. People often stay in unsatisfying relationships longer than they should because ending them feels like losing something, even when staying means missing opportunities for better relationships. Illusory correlation. Illusory correlation emerges from the fundamental way human brains process information. We're designed to detect patterns in relationships because pattern recognition was crucial for survival in our ancestral environment. Recognizing that certain weather patterns predicted storms, that specific animal behaviors signaled danger, or that particular plant characteristics indicated nutrition could mean the difference between life and death. But this same system that helps us navigate a complex world also leads us to see meaningful patterns in random data. The phenomenon appears dramatically in how people form stereotypes and maintain prejudices. When members of minority groups behave badly, those incidents often get more attention and are better remembered than similar behavior by majority group members. This creates an illusory correlation between group membership and negative behavior, even when statistical analysis shows no actual relationship. Sports superstitions demonstrate illusory correlation vividly. Athletes often develop elaborate pre-game rituals because they believe certain behaviors are correlated with success. A baseball player might refuse to wash his uniform during a hitting streak, convinced that cleanliness would jinx his performance. A basketball player might always put on her left shoe before her right because she once scored a career high after following that routine. These superstitions persist because occasional coincidental successes seem to confirm the imaginary relationship. Investment decisions fall prey to illusory correlation regularly. Investors often believe they've discovered patterns in market data that predict future price movements. They might notice that their portfolio performed well on days when they wore a particular tie, or that certain stocks tend to move together in ways that seem meaningful. Technical analysis sometimes involves finding correlations in price charts that feel significant but have no predictive power for future performance. Medical thinking shows illusory correlation too. Patients often believe they've identified triggers for their symptoms based on limited observations. They might think sugar causes their headaches, that weather affects their arthritis, or that stress brings on their allergies, even when systematic tracking would reveal no actual correlation. Healthcare providers aren't immune either. They sometimes see relationships between treatments and outcomes that reflect hope or expectation rather than genuine cause and effect. The phenomenon appears in hiring and performance evaluation decisions. Managers might believe they see correlations between interview characteristics and job performance that don't actually exist. They could think people who ask certain types of questions make better employees, or that candidates from specific schools perform differently, even when objective data shows no such relationships. These illusory correlations can lead to biased hiring decisions that seem data-driven but are actually based on imaginary patterns. Parenting decisions often involve illusory correlations too. Parents might believe certain activities, foods, or routines affect their children's behavior, sleep patterns, or academic performance based on limited observations that seem to show relationships. While some parental intuitions prove correct, others reflect the natural human tendency to find patterns in the normal random variation of child behavior and development. Weather and mood provide another common area for illusory correlation. Many people believe weather strongly affects their emotional state, reporting that rain makes them sad or sunshine improves their mood. While weather can have some psychological effects, research suggests these relationships are often weaker than people perceive. The belief in strong weather-mood correlations may reflect selective attention to instances when mood and weather seem connected, while forgetting times when they don't match. Social media creates particularly fertile ground for illusory correlation. The constant stream of information makes it easy to notice when events seem to co-occur and assume they're related. People might think political events cause market movements, that celebrity deaths happen in clusters, or that their posts perform better on certain days of the week, even when careful analysis would reveal no genuine correlations. The bias can lead to harmful behaviors when people act on imaginary correlations. Someone perceive different cultures and nationalities. Americans might see all Europeans as more sophisticated, all Asians as more academically focused, or all Middle Easterners as more religious, failing to recognize the enormous diversity within these broad regional categories. These overgeneralizations can lead to both positive and negative stereotypes. Just world hypothesis. In 1966, social psychologist Melvin Lerner conducted an experiment that revealed something troubling about human nature. Participants watched a person receive painful electric shocks as part of what they believed was a learning experiment. When told the victim had volunteered for the shocks and would be compensated, observers felt sympathy. But when told the person was chosen randomly and would receive no compensation for their suffering, something unexpected happened. Observers began to rate the innocent victim as less likable and less worthy of sympathy. This counterintuitive reaction illustrates the just world hypothesis, our tendency to believe that the world is fundamentally fair and that people generally get what they deserve. When we encounter evidence that contradicts this belief, innocent people suffering or bad people prospering, we often reshape our perceptions to maintain faith in cosmic justice, rather than accepting that life can be genuinely unfair. The just world hypothesis serves important psychological functions. Believing that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people provides a sense of control and predictability in an uncertain world. If outcomes are based on merit, then by being a good person and making good choices, we can influence our fate. This belief motivates moral behavior and hard work while providing comfort in the face of life's uncertainties. But this comforting belief creates problematic distortions in how we interpret events and judge others. When we see someone suffering misfortune, the just world hypothesis creates pressure to find reasons why they deserved their fate. Rather than accepting that bad things sometimes happen to good people, we search for character flaws, poor decisions, or moral failings that could explain their suffering. Consider how this affects perceptions of poverty. Rather than acknowledging the complex economic, social, and systemic factors that contribute to financial hardship, just world thinking leads many people to focus on individual character explanations. Poor people must be lazy, irresponsible, or lacking in motivation. This perspective allows observers to maintain belief in a fair world, where economic outcomes reflect personal merit, while avoiding uncomfortable questions about systemic inequality or their own advantages. The bias appears dramatically in responses to sexual assault. Rather than confronting the disturbing reality that attacks can happen randomly to innocent people, observers sometimes engage in victim blaming. They focus on what the victim wore, where they went, how much they drank, or whether they took proper precautions. This victim blaming serves to restore belief in a controllable world where bad things only happen to people who somehow invite them through their choices. Medical contexts showcase the just world hypothesis too. When people develop serious illnesses, Observers sometimes assume they must have done something to cause their condition. They didn't exercise enough, ate poorly, lived too stressfully, or ignored warning signs. While lifestyle factors can influence health outcomes, this thinking often extends beyond reasonable causation to maintain the illusion that illness only strikes those who somehow deserve it.